Item A, draft heat policy for the artificial turf.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mrs. Russo is probably has the most detailed information on the heat policy. We had a very detailed conversation at the Wellness Committee that involved all the staff that would be impacted by this policy. I think there was more information shared with the committee that have been included as part of your packet. My suggestions at the time is I don't think a policy should have all the details of practice associated with it, so we tried to distill the information into a policy that we could place again and then direct people to the details if they wanted that. And then so that's basically was the language that was in your packet. And then some of the early feedback I think that I received right away was that the idea of other activities other than physical education were sort of weren't highlighted. So I had made some suggestions to the language, and I had also received some additional suggestions. So I think that is what was handed out in front of you today. And Mrs. Russo, I will certainly defer to you with some of the details that you were looking for. So again, I try to keep the policy language relatively straightforward, and then have the detail follow up behind it.
This one is that I just handed to you.
So Sharon, what did we hand out? I just want to make sure we handed out.
What Kristen had
Yes.
just given us.
Most updated edits.
Yes. So I'm not sure if you all had a chance to look through the policy that was in the packet, but in viewing the policy, really the physical education was the only thing highlighted on the policy page itself, and it didn't speak to the athletic, interscholastic athletic marching band section. So the policy that you have printed in front of you just includes those first two paragraphs, similar to the physical education, highlighting the athletic marching band, because really it's been 3 years really discussing this and looking at other policies throughout the country, really just focus straight on the heat. And we have a very excellent trainers here who really can differentiate with the heat, and we've included the fans, the cooling areas. You know, we've really done a lot to help with the heat, but again, it goes back to the athletic turf too. So unlike other policies, there's a third part, not just the heat and humidity, but the athletic turf. We didn't want to make it very restrictive, but do rely on our trainers and our coaches and their expertise. So you really have essentially two parts: physical education, where we acknowledge our children do not all get acclimated, are not at the same level of physical education, and that is more of a stricter policy with a drop-dead temperature. Whereas our athletes, who after 2 weeks of training and so forth, are more able with the coaches and the trainers to acclimate to the heat. So that's why it's two separate almost.
Yep. So again, Mrs. Russo, through the chair, I just want to make sure I'm clear. So the page that is the top page would be the policy language, and so that would be in the policy manual. And then skipping over the next page, because you've already seen that, then it says procedures for artificial turf use in the heat. So then for support, these would be the procedures. So the athletic director and band director, physical education teachers will all be going over the procedures. But again, what would be included in the policy manual would just be that first page. We'll put, we have to put it somewhere, Sharon, so we have to put the letters and everything to it. This would be the first reading. And again, if anyone wants to make changes or adds, again, to the policy language on that front page, please let me know. We'd like to get this approved in August, so then that's really the hottest time is in the fall. So we'd like to have this up and ready for the start of school. Mrs. Russo, I just want to make sure if the language of the front page is adopted, you would be happy with that policy.
Yes, I did have one question, because where it is the first go-through with it, I didn't know if, do we put anything to be reviewed in the fall of 2018 after we've gone through a year, or is that just, I'll ask Sharon in the fall?
You'll ask.
Okay, all right, perfect.
We can always review the policies.
Anytime.
Okay.
Where'd you get the policy? Did you create it yourself, or was it?
So it's come from all over the country. Vermont has the Vermont superintendent's, Mr. Larkin sent me their policies. Cobb County has one, and theirs has penalties associated with it monetarily if their
really?
schools. So Quincy, Illinois had one from their school department that was written by a cardiologist, a pediatric cardiologist. So it was really taking all these different policies, having the trainer look at it, the wellness committee, and see what might work for Burlington. And the other thing is, if we should have a conversation with the rec department so they're aware if we're moving a practice to later in the day, why that is occurring. So they're aware. The nice thing about the heat advisory in mornings is they're generally not wrong the way they are with the winter when they say, oh, we'll get 10 inches and we get none, or we get supposedly getting 3 and then all of a sudden it's 10 and we're last minute scrambling. So these seem to be a little better forecasted.
It's going to be hot, you know it.
Yeah.
Can I say something? I just,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So if somebody says to me, oh, what is the new turf policy? Can you just explain in a nutshell what this means?
Okay. So for physical education, if there's a heat advisory, our students are going to move to the grass and stay off the turf. If there's a heat warning, and a heat warning feels like 105, heat advisory feels as if it's 100, they will have gym inside. So that's physical ed. Now, the athletics and the marching band work more with the turf field temperature. So depending on the heat index, which is our temperature and humidity, and that's the back chart.
Yeah.
Depending on the heat of the turf, there are different guidelines for the practice to be lessened, to be moved to the grass, or to be canceled until the time in which either the turf is cooler or the temperature heat advisory or warning goes away.
And these warnings are from the National Weather Service?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
I actually spent quite a bit of time reading through it to try to understand it, and it is very complex, and I certainly want to thank all the people who put time and effort into this over the last 3 years. I know it is complex, and I think it's important because from what Ms. Russo says, sometimes the turf field can actually go up to 150 degrees. Mm-hmm. And so to take just the air temperature and the humidity as our guidelines isn't really protecting our children. So I'm really glad that you did this, even though it is very complex. Again, we made a distinction between the kids in the gym classes who are not necessarily in great shape and the athletes in the first 2 weeks, and then after they've been through some conditioning, allowing a little more. And the other thing I would add to what Ms. Russo just mentioned is, in addition to the temperatures at which point different things happen, there's also guidelines for additional water breaks, mm-hmm. for having special equipment out on the field, for having a water cooler out on the field, so a kid forgets their water bottle, there's still water. Whether or not a team is going to use equipment, whether And there's another one. Oh, how many water breaks, how long they are. All those kinds of things are included. So there are guidelines, and again, I want to thank the people who are going to actually implement this, because it's not going to be, it may be obvious to them once they get there, but I know it's going to take a little adjusting to, but it's really important. And, there is this possibility of outdoor practice being canceled over 94 degrees and humidity over 60 and field temperatures under a certain temperature. But it's not going to happen that often. And it's frustrating, I think, for a team and a coach to be canceled. But I think it's, we cancel sports in the winter if there's a snow day. And so if there's extreme weather that endangers our students, I think it's important that we have this policy. And hopefully it wouldn't happen very often. I mean, most of the summer practices I seem to remember, it's been a while since my girls were in it, but they're mostly in the early mornings, late afternoons, and hopefully that will cover these factors. But I think it's important to have. So I want to thank you and all the people who worked on this.
Christine?
Thanks for doing all the work.
No, that's all right. And a lot of the colleges, we took a lot from Brigham Young and Brigham Young, so I say that, University, and a lot of the southern colleges.
I want to know who's going to enforce this policy, Dr. Conti.
Well, I think the PE teachers will be educated. I think we have to, they need to use their professional judgment all the time. I think this is meant to be some guidelines. We have a director of PE and health who will make sure that things get followed. And then for the after-school activities, again, there are professionals involved. I think they need to use some professional judgment, but the athletic director is always involved. And he's even the one, if there's lightning, who can call the game in the middle of the game. So I'm just saying, I think you can't guarantee everything all the time, but I'm saying I think that I think what I like about the policy and then with the procedures behind it, they're detailed enough that provide a framework for decision making, and I think we would allow people to make those decisions, and they're trying to balance that as well too. So they're, as Mrs. Russo was saying, we are trying to provide as many cooling opportunities as we can, and we're managing heat now. So this is only going to provide more clarification and better use. But a hot day or a heat wave shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I think people watch the weather pretty carefully when they have outdoor activities, and this is going to help shape those decisions.
How are we going to inform, instruct, train those people who need to implement this?
Well, the athletic director is going to incorporate the procedures into his coaches meeting at the beginning. So when they go over concussions, when they go over the EpiPens, when they go over the MIAA rules, and they'll go over the heat policy, especially for those fall sports. Choking policy, that's right. Obviously, we won't have to do this for winter sports, and spring sports, we only really get into it in June, but it doesn't really tend to be a problem except for playoffs or other things. So it's really the fall sports that he's going to focus on, which is why we'd like to have this policy done in August, and then he can incorporate it into his preseason fall meetings with coaches. And again, I think the marching band, I'll just talk to Mr. Middleton, and I'll talk to Mr. Bucksbaum, and or ask Mr. Sullivan too, and I think that'll be clear.
Yeah, I think we need this. Glad it's finally, Kristen really chased it down.
She did.
She did a lot of work on this.
Craig gave me that gun.
And
the temperature.
The temperature
gauge.
gun.
the
Oh,
temperature
yes,
gauge.
yeah.
Oops. And I just feel that after all the work and effort and time, we need to be really clear and, get everyone's buy-in so that we really do follow it
Yeah,
carefully.
Has the athletic director seen this? Is he?
he was part of the wellness committee. He is part of the wellness committee, and he was part of the conversation. So yes,
Good.
our head trainer was part of the conversations about this. So we had a lot of voices at the table, and I think
A lot of buy-in.
Yeah, a lot of buy-in, I thought.
So are there special thermometers that measure the surface? Is that or you just drop it from one
That's
to
the
the
They
other?
have they have an infrared that you can direct and point, and where the laser hits, it'll measure the temperature there. So we'll have some available. But again, I just think like any impending storm, you have to sort of pay attention, you have to watch, and at some point you have to make a decision. And then hopefully it's a good decision, but just like snow, you do the best you can. And I think during school vacations, for instance, the athletic director, as Mrs. Simon said, does that now with potentially inclement weather. So we're okay. And I do think having some guidelines makes sense.
All right, so, Matthew, you have something?
And my concern is, our next meeting is August 22nd, when we would be theoretically voting on it. And when do the coaches' practices start?
I think the athletic director is going to incorporate this in even without
Okay.
unless
I
there's
wanted to be sure
huge
that,
objections.
it sounds like there are no objections here. I don't know if we're ready to vote on it, but if it's going to be implemented for the first practice this summer, even if it's a day or two before we meet, then
Yeah.
I would think that would be good.
That
Thank
makes
you.
sense.
He's going to be ready. And he was part of the conversations, again, in the spring, so he's ready.
I prefer to adopt it per our regular policy, just in case people out there want to weigh in,
That's
but I
right.
think it's a good idea to get it up and running. So we'll do that at, what was it, August 22nd?
Is it the
you said?
22nd, am I right?
August 22nd will be our next meeting, and that's when this will be formally on the agenda. And I also want to thank Kristen. I know this has been important to you ever since we got that new field online, and she's done an awful lot of work on it. So I appreciate that. It looks like it's a workable policy, and it's common sense stuff,
Right.
and it's not something that's going to be too onerous, I don't think, to the athletic department to try to implement. So we will take that up at our next meeting, and if anybody at home has any questions or input on that, they can contact us over the next couple of weeks.
All right, Sharon, we should probably, post the draft policy just so people can see.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't you do
So we
that?
can make that, people can comment.
Okay. If there's nothing else on the heat policy, we'll move